The thing about Russell was that he had his own special makeup room. Now, we don't get makeup for when you do a sort of interview away. And so he came into the room really late, which is one of those things that like definitely
disrespectful.
You're off. And his hair was glossier and his skin was shinier
than yours.
And he just, he sort of waltzed in looking gorgeous. And I was like, oh, it's all right for you. You've got all the makeup and you've got the glossy hair. And, he just sort of looked primed and rather wonderful. And I thought, I'm already in a bad mood with you. And you know what it's like, don't you? You sort of get somebody who's sort of celeb status and you think, I was all ready to like you. And now you've turned up an hour late and you've slightly pissed me off. And then he just sort of, as I said, he slightly had me at hello. He did. He
branded you, didn't he?
A bit, yeah.
And in the end, you do end up saying, I think I may have subconsciously began to flirt with him.
Oh God, it was awful. Oh, really awful. I mean, you don't realise you're doing it, and you think that you're above all that. I'm Newsnight. I do the BBC. I'm Newsnight. And then he started sort of saying things like, where do you live and what do you do? And what's Emily really like? And of course, there's nothing more flattering than somebody sounding interested in you. And so I start going on about, well, I am quite often at home. I have a wonderful collection of aprons, and I was like, why am I telling him about my aprons?
Because it's true, you do have a wonderful collection of aprons.
I signal my very fleeting domesticity. Whenever I'm actually at home or actually baking, I'm like, right, it is time for an apron. And whenever I go somewhere, I have to buy an apron just to prove how incredibly domestic I actually am.
So you can evade an interview, as people do and will always do, and are doing very much at the moment in various circles of life, by obfuscating or changing the subject, or by putting the interview back on the interviewer, which is what he did a bit there. And Piers Morgan did a bit something similar. Now, you interviewed Piers Morgan at your house because he's your friend for the Radio Times, and you began from a position of him being an enigma, which you think he is, and I agree, he is. And how deep did you get to dig beyond that?
I don't know if he's an enigma. God, I can't bear the fact that we're both now discussing him. Can you?
He will love it. By the way, his
don't advertise his book.
No, I won't advertise his book. But he says of your book, what does he say? He says it's fantastic, but I can't believe there's only one chapter on me.
Yeah. So thanks, Piers. It's all about you. It's all about you. No, I don't think Piers is an enigma at all. I think he basically, amazingly does what he says on the tin, sort of thing. He just blurts it all out. But what I'm always interested in is whether somebody who seems to have no skin, do I mean no skin?
No, the thickest skin.
No, the thickest skin. Yeah, okay.
Impenetrable skin.
Yeah, so the opposite of what I've just said. So very thick skin. Are they really like that?
Is it possible?
Where do you get hurt? When do you go and curl up in a fetal ball and sob your eyes out? Because he runs towards fire, and you know what that's like. And I do to some extent, where you sort of think, am I really going to go in and say the impossible or do the impossible, take on things that feel really uncomfortable? He does it in a slightly kind of addictive way, doesn't he? About things like sausage rolls that really no one cares about. And I think that's interesting. Is there a moment where you just think, why did I do that? I was having a perfectly nice day. Could have just gone for a coffee and a walk with a dog.
That's his modus operandi. And at the end of the chapter, the Piers Morgan chapter, you ask him about his wife, don't you? And he tells you what he thinks she might think of him, but actually you want to know what she might say.
Well, I know what she says. Luckily,
did you ask her afterwards?
Yeah, I know Celia quite well, and I know exactly what she thinks of him, and it's quite funny. I mean, I wouldn't put that in print in an interview, but it's very funny. He says something like, "Oh, she gets really annoyed with me because I leave the print, the newspaper print all over on my fingertips or something." And I'm thinking, no, it doesn't even touch
really
the surface. I'm a perfectionist, really.
And what about so you open the book, nearly open them, not quite actually, just after the first few pages, with your first encounter with Donald Trump, okay? And you talk about the fact that straight away you discovered. But you probably didn't. You didn't sort of let it settle. But you discovered that it's not that he tells lies, although he does. It's just that he may not recognise the truth and therefore can't help himself. And you end that first chapter with quite a poignant line. You say here, "This then was my first encounter with Donald Trump's hazy relationship with the truth. It was all there before me in black and white, and I had chosen to laugh it off."
I think, you and maybe I were quite kind in that. I mean, I think it is a hazy relationship with the truth. And I think what I found in my encounter was things that I could have picked him up on. I didn't. You know, very early on, he was sort of saying things. He's always about superlatives. So this was a piece that I was doing, a big documentary, and it was about his architecture and his business dealings and all the rest of it. And he said, Emily, I have the biggest ballroom in New York. I have the biggest ballroom. And he made it sound like quite a euphemistic sort of, male thing. And I was like, really? He has the biggest ballroom? I didn't understand what that was about. And I sort of went off and I checked it and I was like, oh, he doesn't actually. But because it was only a ballroom, because I wasn't even going to put it in the piece, I thought, I'm not going to check it. I'm not going to say anything to him. I don't need to call him out on it. So I let it go. And in my head, I sort of think, yeah, that's the beginning of it. You don't pick up on the little things, and then the little things become bigger, and they become bigger. And actually, I think it was Alistair Campbell who used this really interesting phrase. He said, it's not that we're in a, everyone's talking about post-truth age. Yeah. He said, we're in a post-shame age. So you can say that's a lie, and they don't even mind. There's no shame. There's no embarrassment. It's an age of impunity where you can say whatever you want and know that not only will you get away with it, but you'll probably get what you want from it. The lie will work, or the branding will work, or the slogan will work. Yeah. You make it work in your favour, because it's almost like we've stopped caring, or we've stopped knowing how to care enough to switch it off. So 2 interviews where you were requested to go and interview someone who you may have wanted to interview anyway, but in the end they asked you to come to them to try and right a wrong in their eyes and try and get their message out. And one was Theresa May, too late in many people's eyes and ears after the fact when Grenfell happened, and the other one was Prince Andrew. And they both, again, as I say before, requested this interview, and they both wanted to get a particular message across. But the one thing they both seemed to leave at home, which is the one thing they needed, was their emotions, or at least empathy and compassion. And they both made the same almost fatal mistake, didn't they? And isn't it interesting that they both asked for the interview, but because it was a thinking request, they didn't realise that it was a situation that needed feeling. I think to say Theresa May asked for the interview might be slightly overplaying it. She wanted a place to get her message out, which is slightly different. Number 10 requested the interview, and they said you can have 5 minutes. Right. So they basically said you can have a couple of bites with her. They wanted her, a couple of sound bites. She wanted to go and do it on location. She came out of this church and it was very, very tense and very febrile after Grenfell, and she got called a coward by people waiting there. So she decided she didn't want to do it right there in the street. She didn't want to do it down there. So they got her in the car, brought her to Broadcasting House, and they said, Emily can have, but it was actually not really meant to be an interview. It was meant to be what we call, a grab, two bites. And what we did was we said, this is a really important story, and we've got the Prime Minister coming here. We got 2 chairs, we got cameras, and once you've got somebody sitting down, it becomes an accountability interview as opposed to a, what do you want to tell the nation? Sort of, the world, it was the world, wasn't it? It was. And so actually, it was really fast thinking on the part of our sort of crew and the BBC editors, who just said, we're going to get the 2 chairs, we're going to get 2 cameras, she's going to sit down. If she's coming here, let's try and see what we can ask. And I think that's right. I think she came to tell us about a fund that she'd set up. We've got a fund, which in her head was one soundbite. I just want to tell the BBC we've got this fund and it's all going to be fine. And by then, there was just too much. There was too much emotion. There were people who were rallying that very day outside the councils in Kensington, the town hall offices. There were people who were still out of their houses. There were people who had not heard from relatives and didn't know what to do. There were just people with so many questions. And actually, the one thing you can't do in that situation is not ask the questions that people are hammering your brain with. So that was what it was. And I think if you come in thinking, this is my message, I'm just going to do my message. John Prescott always used to do that. Do you remember? He'd just sort of say the same thing 5 times, thinking sometimes it was a soundbite, even when it was actually, a live interview. And so she came saying, I'm going to give you this message, and it's about the funding. And we asked the other stuff. And I think as you say, she couldn't quite commute that, head to heart. And I've no doubt that she had huge reserves of sympathy and pain and anger and frustration with everything that's going on. But there are different styles, aren't there? There's different styles of politician, different styles of people. She couldn't do that. She couldn't do that with me then.
The Chris Evans Breakfast Show with Sky.